Well, it's great to be with you, and I've been looking forward to this very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Um, I'm going to veer a little bit from the structured notes that you may have before you, just for a little bit of variety. But the main thing that I talk about when I speak to people about evangelism is the role of asking questions. And let me begin by asking a question. Um, uh, what happens when somebody asks you a question? Now, I'm not asking you really to answer it, but my guess is that you already started thinking about it and answering it when I asked the question. That's what a question does. And I think far too much evangelism and apologetics has been making statements and not asking enough questions. And so all I want to try to do is encourage people to become really, really expert question askers and conversation partners. For many years, I was on the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ, a very evangelistic organization, and I learned a ton from that, and I'm really very grateful for it, but I do see some weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses was that in my training in evangelism, the way I was trained was that I did all the talking. I did far all of the talking in an evangelistic conversation, and I just hoped that the non-Christian I was talking to would say very, very little. I might ask a few questions, but they were pretty much yes or no questions and required not too much more of a response other than, oh, and what I have found is that the more we can get the other person talking, the better. And so asking questions and drawing them out. And so I think about your role. You're involved in media and in engaging in a culture in a way that asks questions and prompts thinking and prompts discussion. So I'm very, very excited about the opportunities that you have. Let me try to, I'm going to offer two images that might shape what I want to say today. The first is the image of a recipe. I'm guessing that you've all seen a recipe, and maybe hopefully most of you have tried to follow one of them. But you know that a recipe has a top part and a bottom part. And the top part is the list of ingredients, and the bottom part is more the procedure. Preheat the oven to this amount, take these two ingredients, mix them together, put them in the refrigerator overnight, prepare a pan this way. And if you only had the top part of the recipe, you might come up with a successful dish. But you probably won't, because you need more than just the list of ingredients. You need to know the sequence. You need to know what has to happen first and allow it to kind of meld for a while before you progress on. And so I think a lot of evangelism and apologetics has been only the top part of the recipe. We know, okay, what are the key ingredients of a gospel presentation? Well, you have to say something about God, about people, about Jesus, about a response. There, that's a gospel presentation. Boom. Or what are common questions people ask today, and what are the answers? Here are the ingredients for if someone asks the question about why does a good God allow evil and suffering? Well, you want to make sure you cover this, this, and this. There, boom. And sometimes that works. And in the past, I think it worked better than it does today. But we need that bottom part. We need to not only know what are the questions that people are asking and what are the best answers, but we also need to think through, how do I deliver the answer? What might be incremental ways of delivering an answer? Are there certain plateaus people need to reach before we go on to the next spot and the next spot and the next spot? So that's one image I want you to have in your mind, is about this image of the recipe. The other image that I'd like you to have in your mind is the image of the alphabet. And if you could imagine a line with the alphabet on it, so A, B, C, D, E, all the way to Z or Z, A to Z. And what I mean by this is this would be a spectrum that all non-believers would be on in relationship to how close they are to becoming a Christian. So on this side of the spectrum at Z or Z, they're very, very close to becoming Christian. All you would need to say to that person is, would you like to become a Christian? And they would say, you know, I've been thinking about this a whole lot, and I was just reading the Gospel of John last night. And so you're there, okay. On the other side of the spectrum is letter A, is the most hardened, angry atheist, and no, you Christians are ridiculous. And they have a much further way to come on this A to Z scale. And it seems to me that a lot of evangelistic strategies, materials, tools that were put together in the evangelical Christian world, particularly in the United States and in Western Europe, they were formulated 50, 40 years ago or so, when a large number of the population was already over here. And evangelism at that point was TUVWXYZ. You could say to someone, would you like to know God personally? And they would say, ooh, I didn't know you could know God personally. Please tell me how. And so evangelism, Tim Keller talks about this as being connecting the dots. People already had the dots in their worldview. They already believed in a God, or the God they believed in sort of was the God that Christians were talking about. They believed there was such a thing as truth. They believed there was such a thing as sin. They may not have used those words. And for us, it was just putting words to it and connecting it. But our world and our culture has shifted rather dramatically, and a much larger perspective of people are down on this side of things. And so to say to someone who's at letter D, would you like to know God personally? That's not a good starting point for them. It's like to know God. Which God are you talking about? There's lots of different gods. And I'm not really big on religion. And my understanding about religious people, they're the problem in the world. They're the cause of all sorts of, I don't think I really want to consider this. So what we need to do is think of strategies that can move people incrementally from D to E and E to F, et cetera. I should tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm originally from suburbs of New York City. I grew up in a Jewish home. I didn't become a Christian until I was in university, in my second year in university. And I've always been involved in ministry where things were much further on this side of the spectrum. When I was with Campus Crusade, we would go to national staff conferences, and we would hear of all these great success stories of things that worked so very, very well in evangelism and apologetics in the Southern United States and the Midwest United States. And those places culturally were much further on this side of the spectrum. So people would say what worked really well in Kansas and Alabama. And I would be there sitting, because we were on in ministries in Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And I thought, I don't think that stuff's going to work where we are. And so I'm grateful that I was given a whole lot of freedom to experiment with things. And it seems to me that the ministry that as I understand it, that you're called to in media engagement, there's a whole lot more that you can do down over here through media engagement. It seems to me this is the realm in which you live and live out your calling. Maybe to try to put with other categories, this is sowing and this is reaping. And it seems to me that we need a whole lot more thought about sowing and a lot more rigorous thinking of what could move people gradually along. Please hear me carefully. I know that God is certainly capable of moving people from A to Z in a nanosecond if he wants to. And sometimes he does. But more and more research, we're finding people take a long time to move along, especially if there are blockages, things that keep them stuck for a very, very long time. Now, there are some people who are stuck here for a very long time, and then something comes along, they get an idea, or they read the scriptures or something, and it speeds along the process. But even so, there's a lot of work that has to happen here. I'm hoping this is making sense. Is this connecting well here? We want to become really expert question askers and people who answer question with a question. When people came to Jesus and asked him questions, very often he did not answer them, at least not right away, not immediately. People came to him and said, is it lawful for us to heal on the Sabbath? And he said, well, if you had an animal that fell into the ditch, wouldn't you pull it out? Or they said, is it lawful for us to get a divorce? He said, what did Moses write? Or they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar? He said, let me see a coin. Whose face is on the coin? You see what that's doing? It engages people in the answering process. And so we want to become really experts at delaying an answer by inserting a question. So here's where I want to zoom in just in scripture. And then I want to give you a couple of samples of what this might sound like. And then I'll try to save as much time as I can for Q&A and involvement with you. So in the notes that I sent to you, there's this part where I say about Paul's examples. And in particular, what I look at is Acts 17, verses 1 through 5. And I list a couple of things that we can learn from there. So I'm not going to explore that now because the notes explain it. There's this process that Paul used in a number of different places in the book of Acts, where it says he reasoned with them from the scriptures. And that word reasoned implies a dialogue, a back and forth. But that phrase, he reasoned from the scriptures, it's this beautiful intersection of human logic and argument, along with the supernatural, thus saith the Lord, here's what the scriptures say. So I encourage you to look at Acts 17, 1 through 5 on your own, and especially look at the verbs in there. He reasoned, he argued, he persuaded. What I want to look at instead is just a very quick contrast. And we won't look deeply at this, but I just want to remind you of how Paul approached things differently in Acts 13, Acts 17, and then in between, the one that's most intriguing to me, Acts 14. So very quickly, Acts 13 is when Paul gets up in a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue, on a Sabbath day in the city of Pisidian Antioch, and he gets up and he proclaims the gospel, but he's starting where this religious Jewish audience already was, meaning they already believed in God. They believed in God and they worshiped God. They weren't apathetic toward him. And they believed the scriptures, and they believed that God had worked in history through the nation of Israel. So Paul already could, if you remember that A to Z thing, he's way down over here, and he was able to just start with their shared assumptions. They believe in God, they believe in truth, they believe in the scriptures. And so he points to particular places in scripture and says, see, this is a prediction of the Messiah. Jesus is the one who fulfilled this. Okay, so that's very quick, Acts 13. Contrast Acts 17, the long speech that Paul gives beginning in verse 16 through the end of the chapter on Mars Hill to a group of non-religious secular philosophers. I'm assuming that you've already dug into this passage on your own. If you haven't, please do. It's one of the most brilliant, beautiful presentations of pre-evangelism in all of the scriptures. And it's Paul using things in their culture to point to the gospel. He looks around, he sees, I see you have all these statues. I see that you're very religious. And he quotes their poets. He doesn't quote the scriptures. He doesn't quote Old Testament prophets. He quotes their poets. And it sure seems to me that our world today is far more like Athens in Acts 17 than Pisidian Antioch in Acts 13 or Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. And so we need to know how to quote the poets of our day. And it seems to me the most significant poets of our day are the songwriters and the screenplay writers, the people who produce movies and television shows, and the people who write the lyrics to songs. Those are the things that are grabbing a hold of people's emotions. And so we need to know how to quote their poets and say, you know, some of the things they're saying are the same things that I'm saying from the scriptures. We probably need an example. I just saw not too long ago Paul McCartney was being interviewed on one of the late night television shows here, being interviewed by Stephen Colbert. So I'm kind of hoping you know who those two people are. So Stephen Colbert is talking to Paul McCartney about his song Yesterday, and says it's one of the most recorded songs in all of history. And he said, I'm just curious if you've heard other people, cover your song and sing it. And he said, oh, yes. Ray Charles and Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. And he said, oh, yeah. I said, have you listened to all of them? He said, well, no, but I had some friends put together the list of what they thought was the top 10. And I listened to them. And, I think I really like Marvin Gaye's cover of it the best. And then Paul McCartney says, but you know what? It's kind of funny. Some of them changed the words. They changed my words. What I wrote in that song was when I said, I said something wrong. Now I long for yesterday. He said there was a couple of them that they changed the words. They didn't say that. They said, I must have said something wrong. Now I long for yesterday. And Paul McCartney was just making fun of them and saying, it's like they didn't own up to it. They didn't acknowledge that they were wrong. It's like, well, I must have said something wrong, but beats me what it was. I don't know. And Stephen Colbert chimes in and says, oh yeah, that's like when people make those phony apologies when they say, well, I apologize if anybody was hurt by what I said. If it's not a real apology. And I thought, okay, now, I'm not particularly impressed with the deep theological reflection of Paul McCartney or Stephen Colbert. I hope that's not insulting to any of you, but I just thought, isn't that interesting? They're pointing out, there is a need to be honest and own up to our sin. They didn't use those words, but when you say, well, I must have said something wrong, you're not really dealing with the heart of the problem. So I use that quote. I want to say, there's a world of difference between, well, I apologize if anybody was offended, versus, no, I was wrong. I was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I need forgiveness. And that's a pre-evangelistic message that we need to preach. And we need to find their poets to quote. So Acts 13, Jewish presuppositions shared, Acts 17, quoting their poets. But if you have a Bible, look at Acts chapter 14. I just find this to be such an intriguing passage about the way Paul preaches the gospel now in a very different setting. He's in Lystra and Derbe, and he's talking to a religious group of people, but they're not religious Jewish people. They're not secular philosophers like in Athens, but they're religious people who worship Greek gods. And Paul and Barnabas heal this man, and the people all think that Paul and Barnabas are Greek gods. So look what happens beginning in verse 14 of Acts 14. It says, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, that people were worshiping them as gods, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, men, why are you doing this? We too are only men, humans like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. Here it is. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Do you see what he's doing? He's not quoting the Old Testament prophets because they didn't believe them or they didn't accept them. He's not quoting their poets. He's looking to God's general revelation, God's common grace, God's pouring out his revelation in a general way through rain, crops, food, and joy in your hearts. I got to tell you, food as pre-evangelistic strategy is just very exciting to me. And my Jewish background makes a big deal about food. But if you can use food and say, isn't this delicious? What kind of a God creates a world with strawberries or inspires people to take cocoa beans and make chocolate and then make chocolate covered strawberries? I could go on this for a long time. I think he's saying there is a kind of joy-based apologetic through God's general revelation and his common grace that is a pointer to the specific God that we want people to worship. I'm hoping this is making sense to you. Zoom has its limitations, but I think that this is a route of pre-evangelism that we need to really take advantage of. We need to look at God's fingerprints in general revelation and common grace and say to people, isn't this great? Where do you think this comes from? By the way, just to kind of set this in context, so I call this joy-based apologetics, and the contrast is misery-based apologetics. So misery-based apologetics says, aren't you miserable? You must be miserable. You don't have God in your life. You must be miserable. Let me tell you how you can get your misery taken care of. You need to believe in Jesus. Now, by the way, I'm sounding kind of sarcastic on that, and I'm sorry. There is a very valid use of misery-based apologetics. That's what I think Jesus was doing in John chapter 4 to the woman with the woman at the well. He's saying, "No, aren't you thirsty? Your life hasn't really worked out all that well. You're miserable, aren't you? You've had 5 husbands and they haven't worked out, and the guy you're living with now isn't all that great. Wouldn't it be great if you weren't miserable and you found water that satisfied your soul so that you wouldn't be miserable?" So there is a basis for misery-based apologetics, but I have found that only works some of the time. It works with people who are miserable, who are willing to admit that they're miserable. There's a whole lot of people that we say to them, "Aren't you miserable?" And they say, "No, not really." And then we say, "Yeah, but you know, like, aren't you looking for something?" And they go, "Not really. I got this really great job. My girlfriend really likes me. We're going to Paris next week. I mean, no, things are great." And they go, "Isn't there a God-shaped vacuum inside of you?" And they look at you like, "What is wrong with you?" And you say, "Isn't life becoming more miserable?" And they say, "Well, if you keep talking, it's certainly going to get that way." I'm really hoping some of you laughed at that. I can't tell. But so when misery-based apologetics doesn't work, it does seem to me that sometimes we can do joy-based apologetics and point to beauty in creation, evidence of design, not so much in the intelligent design argument. That's important too, but I'm talking more about, why are there so many different flowers? Why does a sunset cause people just to stop and sometimes even just watch it and then applaud at the end? Why do people like Mozart so much, or Van Gogh, or eggplant parmesan? There are all these things. C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, he was saying that there's a difference between adoration and gratitude. And gratitude says, how kind of God to give me such and such. But adoration says, what kind of a being is it who sends forth beautiful things like this? And he finishes the paragraph with this line: "One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun." So it seems to me that in media presence, what we need to do is we need to point people to those sunbeams, to the beauty, to films and television shows that grab a hold of our hearts. And we say, well, why is that so moving? What is it about the God who created us and this world so that there's a connection?